My name is Josh Levene. I'm one of the coordinators for the UK River Rights Network. I'm also a director of Love REs and on the steering group for the UK Rights of Nature Network. So today, basically, I guess, going to talk about what happens. How do we turn all of this theory into practice? And if I've got one key message for you, I guess, is that it's river charters are sort of slogan. They're actually a practical governance tool. So we'll look at how to turn it from theory to practice, some of the advantages, some of the pitfalls. And I'm going to sort of proceed now because of timing at an almost supernatural speed. So buckle up and we'll get going. So as you're all probably aware, the context of rivers, in particular in the UK, is not great. And there seems to be a sort of diffused accountability and quite a slow response to addressing the state of UK rivers at the moment. And it had led to a just sort of public fury about it. And that really in the public's perception, the current system isn't really delivering for either the rivers themselves or people. And it was in this context that Love REs emerged just 3-4 years ago, where it felt that there was also the voice of the community was not in decision-making processes. And we also looked at the idea of, well, perhaps the idea of nature having rights itself, and we gained inspiration from New Zealand, where the Whanganui River was the first sort of entity in the world to actually be granted legal personhood. We also, like the Dart, really building on the sort of the shoulders of giants of what Bioregional Learning Centre have done. It's like perhaps we can apply that approach here to the U's. And from that, since then, the UK River Rights Network has emerged as more and more rivers start to think about, is a river rights approach applicable to our rivers? Could it possibly help in this regard? And so I'm going to draw upon lessons both from Love REs as an example, but also the wider river rights movement in the UK. So yes, in March this year, after 2 years of community and stakeholder consultation, the Ouse Charter was formally recognised by Lewes District Council, and since then it's been also recognised by the other councils, which cover the whole catchment. So we started with a summit, which included academics, lawyers, activists, campaigners, artists, ecologists, bringing all these different minds together, interdisciplinary approach really to examine what is the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and constraints of a river rights approach and developing a charter. And we then set off on a tour of all the different communities in the Ouse catchment, and engaging communities around questions around what do they care about, what do they love about the river, what are the hopes and fears for it, and also asking them about the charter itself. And you can see that similar approaches like the mapping exercise and these cards which ask people these questions such as what's your favorite memory about the river, it draws out and reminds people their love for the river and what they actually care about. And we were able to then sort of put those up into a more electronic form of mapping. And there was overwhelming support for the rights of the Ouse. Interestingly, those which were most against, absolutely against having the river having any kind of rights at all, came from sort of like polar opposites of the same spectrum. So some were for religious grounds, felt that wasn't something that it could support, and that humans nature is there purely for the benefit of humans. And on the other end of the spectrum is like, well, how can a river have rights? It's just made up of sort of different compounds and minerals, like and H2O and what have you. And it's like, well, you mean like as opposed to humans, which are kind of just made up of minerals and compounds and H2O. So the charter was passed, and here are the rights. I guess the main thing to sort of the two things to point out about these. One is that they are based on what does the river need to thrive, as far as like we know at the moment, ecologically speaking. What does that environment, that ecosystem, need to thrive? And so they're not based on some sort of just people's ideas plucked out the sky. It's based on science. The only thing which is sort of added there is the right to an active and influential voice in decisions which affect it. So this is what gives the charter teeth, really. When Jane was talking about governance, it's like, okay, someone actually or something needs to speak and protect these rights. So, as I said, it's that sort of inspired very rapidly different initiatives around the country of other rivers taking this on board and trying it out. There's actually more than this now I'm aware of. So when we talk about, well, how do you actually go about doing this? I talk about the challenge of implementing river rights and these three different dimensions of change. So the first one is a social cultural dimension. So how do we enable people to make that sort of shift from a purely human-centered perspective to one which is more nature-centric? So in terms of their attitudes and their behaviours, and how do we create that societal norm that we are part of nature, not separate from it, that nature isn't simply a resource there for our benefit, but it's something of intrinsic value, of inestimable value and worth. And then there's a kind of professional dimension. It's like, okay, practically, how are we going to go about implementing a charter? How can it actually be useful or not? And the way which we think the best way to do this is actually to map those different rights I mentioned in the previous slide to what is the metrics and the data which would indicate whether a right is at risk of being broken or even has been broken. And then what are the existing laws and regulations which then need to be sort of acted upon relating to each of those rights if they are broken, and then who takes that action, who's accountable for fixing that particular issue. And then there's this institutional dimension of okay, we actually need appropriate policies, systems and laws which support rights of nature approaches or rights of rivers approaches. And the thing I would also add to that is resourcing. That's the sort of the thing which we're all short of all the time. But charters can help to mobilise increased resources. The other challenge is who represents the river. And there's sort of 5 issues to consider here. Whoever it is who represents the river, some kind of guardian, they need to have that eco-centric or nature-centric perspective and not just talk on behalf of humans. The voice needs to be active, not passive, not just invited to the room but doesn't really take part at all. They need to be independent from any existing priorities or organisations which may be represented, for instance, on a catchment partnership. They need to have influence. There needs to be a way which actually that voice counts, and not it being a sort of tokenistic voice. And obviously they need to be accountable to all the different stakeholders. So practically how we go about doing this, if you're thinking about not just for rivers but really any kind of landscape, we need to demystify what rights-based approaches means with different stakeholders, and co-produce some kind of charter with both communities, but also with local authorities and key stakeholders, and if possible, try and get that regulator sign off or the council sign off. But it's not necessarily critical, but it obviously does strengthen and give you teeth. Then each of those rights needs to be mapped with the metrics and what data you're already collecting, what triggers are there, what are the appropriate laws or regulations, and then what actions. So that kind of trigger action sequence, you need to sort of pilot it, I would suggest. And even if it's just on one particular right, give it a go. Then Guardian, who's actually going to represent the river and how? What's the governance mechanism there? And then institutionalizing these principles and approaches of a nature rights approach within your organization. So how does it shift maybe subtly your own strategies, plans, or even your organizational culture? So some of the advantages, it does provide us with this much more sort of clearer, emotionally resonant yardstick to make decisions by. So this is something which communities can understand quite readily, the concept of rights, and there's only 8 of them. So it cuts through a lot of that kind of complexity. It provides a much sharper shared decision-making frame. And so it sort of helps us to avoid these sort of competing agendas which often exist. Better monitoring, I guess we can align people all in the same direction around what is it we're actually trying to monitor, what's the impact, what's the goal. And then this sort of, it's really prioritizing what's overall what is best for the river, rather than small scale project work. It's focusing minds on how does it contribute to the rights of the river. So you've got, it clearly links much more the sort of monitoring data to action in that data and triggers action sort of sequence I mentioned about before. And it provides us really a new form of accountability, and so it's much clearer about who acts when rights are breached, and it's replacing this sort of finger pointing culture which can exist in some arenas. It's more publicly visible rights dashboard, so the community can actually kind of track what's going on at the same time. Also provides us with legal and planning leverage in nature recovery strategies, biodiversity net gain negotiations, and it shifts things again from this. It says actually this is about the protection of rights. It's not about an adversarial request. So, for instance, when you're negotiating Section 106 agreements, and it can unlock new finance and innovation. It's an appealing, attractive offer for stakeholders to work jointly together towards a shared vision of fulfilling the rights of the landscape. And then there is more civic engagement. People understand it more. It has really helped mobilise citizen science, more citizen scientists, certainly for the use in our case. And it gets to the root of some of these issues, some would argue. So what are the actual, it helps us to answer this question of what is right relationship with nature in the early 21st century? What does it need to be? And making that shift from that we're separate from nature or nature is resource, the other way. And therefore it mobilizes communities and the public to get behind and act in a way which is more responsible to the river. So water companies often quite like this approach because it's going to make their lives easier. And obviously charters outlive election cycles, corporate cycles, and there is a much more of an emphasis on long-term stewardship over short-term extractivism. So some of the common misunderstandings, they're not just symbolic, they are this practical governance tool. It's the charters, the huge charter at least, it's not for the river, it's actually for the catchment and the bioregion. So it covers the land, the flora and fauna within the whole catchment. It is essentially rights for nature or rights for a landscape. It's not focused on community rights. So one of the problems I think we had with the Dart Charter was that there was this assumption by some that it was mixed up with right to roam, for instance, or the right to swim. It's not the same. It's all about what is good in the best interests of the river. It doesn't replace existing laws. It strengthens them and helps leverage them in a better way. It doesn't provide legal personhood, but it does link to statutory mechanisms which already exist, and they're not legally binding, but they do offer this moral and political leverage, which is what people kind of gets people out of bed, certainly with the public. And it's not the duty of us, probably most of us on this call alone to uphold this. It's something which it brings in all of the stakeholders which aren't often included in decision making. All of us have a duty to uphold those rights if you live within the catchment. So some of the pitfalls and how to avoid them. Try and avoid the tokenism by pairing each right with indicators, thresholds, and agreed escalation route. Avoid the top-down implementation of charters. Build it, co-design it with stakeholders from the bottom up. Human and nature rights clash. We often get that, but human right. How do you sort of balance that out? But the two really are inextricably linked. But it at least makes those trade-offs much clearer. Avoid greenwashing. So try and get the river guardians. Make sure that they are wholly independent. And they're not the same as statutory person. They're being really explicit about what their legal status is. So in conclusion, river rights do help us answer that sort of question of what is right relationship with nature. They work best when they use an operational tool versus a slogan, and they can help us cut through complexity. We do have all of the tools in our toolbox already to do this. And so our job perhaps is to translate those words into thresholds, matrix, data, and dashboards, and the actual right governance tools. So rights lead to ultimately positive impact for our natural environments.